Thank you very much. So hi everyone, thank you all for sticking around to the end of the session. I know it's been a long couple of days packed with lots of really interesting talks. So I did want to add a disclaimer and just say, if you're looking at my subject and wondering how does this relate to classification taxonomies, it is heavily based in historical research rather than classification with metadata, but the Encyclopaedia Britannica is a publication that was based on heavy taxonomies. It was published at a time of a lot of attempts to make sense of meaning in the world and attempts to classify. So that's just a disclaimer to add that this is sort of the approach I'm taking with looking at knowledge organisation. So the key questions that have really come out of my research, amongst a lot of others, are how can patterns of change in subject knowledge relating to race and slavery be identified over time? And then from that, what types of knowledge networks are formed between terms and articles in the Encyclopaedia Britannica? Now, I do have a lot of other avenues of inquiry, but I think these are the two things that I've come back to. And I think what resounds with a lot of the other talks that we've seen is that I'm questioning what is omitted as well as what is actually physically present. So the first part of my research has really looked into what do we know is present, how can we identify that, assess that, but then what isn't included or what is vaguely referred to, and how do we adjust that and look at that. So just to introduce you to my text, this is the Encyclopaedia Britannica. I'm looking at the first 8 editions, which ranges from 1768 to 1860. The editions that I'm looking at cover 109,393 pages of text. So it is quite an enormous data set. So in physical terms, 135 volumes, each of which are quite chunky. So what's interesting about the Encyclopaedia Britannica is that its value came from its organizational system, which is how it marketed itself, setting it aside from other publications. So here, which you probably can't read because the writing's quite small in this extremely short, catchy title, it says, it's a dictionary of arts, science, and miscellaneous literature constructed on a plan by which the different sciences and arts are digested into the form of distinct treatises or systems, the history, theory, and practice of each, according to the latest discoveries and improvements, and full explanations given of the various detached parts of knowledge. As I said, very catchy. So what it was really trying to do was to classify information. It is alphabetized, but there are also references made to longer essays that unify topics, which is what it's referring to. So skull redirects to anatomy, and there is a more general discussion of anatomy given in that respect. So my research is in collaboration with the National Library of Scotland and their EB dataset. So this is what the data foundry looks like. And this is where I downloaded the data that I used. Briefly to mention the data set, because I don't want to spend too much time on this. The data foundry has images of the text, which I then used and ran through the handwritten text recognition software platform Transcribus to generate a more usable data set than the OCR data set that was available through the data foundry. There were far too many unpredictable errors to make it a really usable data set for analysis. And then I also wanted to mention the 19th Century Knowledge Project, which is led by Peter Logan, which is currently working on cleaning up some of the editions of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. So I've used the 7th edition from that project, and then I've used the rest with my own data that I've created. So what became really apparent in doing the initial parts of my research was that there are lots of different information avenues to explore, but what was really coming out was that there were explicit lines of inquiry to follow, but also implicit. So examples of explicit articles where you might expect to find information on slavery. So slave, cotton, sugar, so focusing on the person. Slavery also appears, so focusing on the act, but also commodities that might have references to slavery or might make general indications that there are links to be made, but also geographical locations, so Jamaica, West Indies. So these are the places you'd expect to start, which if you were doing this research manually is where you would likely begin. So if you're wondering why I decided to use text mining for this, I think 100,000 pages of text speaks for itself. Text mining is used to look at large data sets to identify patterns, to extract data that can be used to identify patterns and gain different insights than you might just reach with analog research. So on a simple level, I wanted to look at frequency counts. So I have a keyword list, which is basically words that I'm expecting to appear. So what I'm intending to do the frequency is to identify if the words I think are going to appear throughout the editions do appear, and if they don't, but also how frequently they appear. Does this change over time? But just the plain numbers aren't enough. You need to understand the context that these are using. So keyword context is a large part of this as well. And then I'll also be doing network analysis to see where links are made between the text. And I'll explain a bit more of that shortly. So these are some results that will be coming out in an article later this year that were generated with a supercomputer platform called Francis, which is currently not publicly available, but I was given the opportunity to do a case study. So this is just to show you an example of the frequencies that we can detect, to sort of see where patterns might emerge in text, where certain things appear. So this is commodities, so sugar, cotton, indigo, rice. Cotton is the leader here on this purple line and sharply increases in use in the later editions. This was just one avenue that I had the option to explore. So these are just the very starting points of the research to identify what I might need to follow up on. Keywords in context help to shape more of this knowledge and understand where it's coming from, what links might possibly be made. These are from first edition, volume 1, so it references to slaves. A lot of these references are to slavery or slaves in ancient Rome, so don't tell me an awful lot about the contemporary slave trade that was happening at the time. So the period that this publication covers is sort of the height of transatlantic slavery and then the move towards abolition. So this is really telling in itself of what sort of knowledge was being discussed at the time. So I'm still in the data collection stage, so I'll be doing more analysis of how this changes or doesn't change over editions, but this is what I'll be focusing on. And this was a slightly unexpected first result for looking at the context, so I'm looking forward to seeing where that leads. So network analysis, I think, is where I'm going to see a lot of the really interesting connections between the knowledge organizations made in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. So I want to know which article the linked explicitly with reference points. For example, CX, which you can see here. This is the 3rd edition, which says slave, see slavery, which is immediately underneath, so it's easy to follow. But there's a lot of references made to other places in the text. So how are these different parts of the information linked? How do we follow them through? And network analysis is something I'm hoping to do, which involves picking out the nodes, figuring out what links to what, and then hopefully creating a very busy network diagram to link these together. This is also from the 3rd edition, which redirects to moral philosophy. And this is just a little snapshot of some of the links that are made between the articles in the 3rd edition. So slave links to slavery, slavery redirects to philology, right? Moral philosophy, gladiators, property and theology, which I think is interesting in itself because there are no explicit links made to commodity production, certain areas that you might expect to see mentioned in reference to slavery. I think theology and moral philosophy you might expect to see just because of some of the ideas that were circulated at the time. What you see in abolitionist literature, I think, feeds into that too. But I'm really interested why some of these don't appear and what that says. So text mining is a really valuable tool in information collection, but the extraction itself doesn't tell you everything you need to know, which is why I've taken a sort of multifaceted approach and want to look at the frequencies, but also the context that words are used in, because that's where you really start to establish how the knowledge connects to each other. And then using the network analysis to really map out these connections. Ideally, if I have time for the project, I'll be looking at the references such as the slavery, and the connections that map out from there. But I'd also be interested to see the articles where slavery is mentioned, but there isn't an explicit reference to see other articles. How do those connect together? What could we potentially see from those? So we can start to identify patterns, and hopefully this could be potentially used as a tool in exploring the Encyclopaedia Britannica for other framework for other research areas, sort of running through the process, seeing how you might approach this with such a huge quantity of text covering quite a large time period. And
so we're out of time, but do finish up if you want.
I was just going to go to the last point. So there are potentially wider applications in constructed information sources. So what I'd be interested in is if anyone's thoughts on this. As I said, I'm still in the data collection, so what I've discovered so far seems to generally support existing knowledge. But I think when I'm picking out, when I can actually see where there are omissions made or there are very slight sort of implicit references to some of these keywords, I think that's where the real value will be. And I'd be interested in seeing how that might be applied more generally out with the subject. So thank you very much.